Continuing chapter 4 of part 4. In this discourse of his doctrine, Jesus is at pains to define his relation to the system of morals taught in the sacred books of the Jews. Not really. But he was a restorer of the law to what it was before it was Judaism for his time. It's pretty simple to understand. If, as he taught, his followers were to endure a great persecution for righteousness' sake, and on account of Jesus, it was natural to infer that it would be on account of the kind of righteousness which they should learn from him. And if that were such as to raise persecution, it must be because it was opposed to the righteousness taught in their law and in their prophets. Well, not the base, but perhaps the Gemara and even Mishnah, or, whatever it was called at the time. The jurisprudence, the authority of these rabbis. They took issue with that. Try to put religion back in the hands of the people, and people get upset. Jesus takes occasion to correct this by showing that he held to the law, that it was the Pharisees who had a new righteousness, and that it was this fact that he should teach a righteousness which, while it opposed that of the Pharisees, I don't know if it opposed more than just, was indifferent. It doesn't matter whether you agree or not. This is what I'm on, right? Accorded with that of the law, really accomplished and fulfilled it by giving it a spirit and by vitalizing it, that should bring him trouble from a generation that had gone far astray from Moses and the prophets. The law and the prophets constituted the great basis of Jewish morals and religious institutions. The law, as the Luck says, kept alive in the people a sense of their need of salvation. The prophets perpetually sustained them by the hope that want would one day be satisfied. Jesus must have meant something more than merely presenting the facts of his history, the counterpart of what the prophets set forth, or in the morality of his life, an example of perfect observance of the moral law. That's one of the things about the Nebiim, right? They're living words. He meant to say that all those who looked upon the work of the Messiah as that of mere abolition, or abolition at all, mere losing, mere doing away, had made a total misapprehension. His work was not negative but positive. So far from doing away the law, he came to show the world that even the moral law written on Sinai stone, our living human hearts, is imperfect in the sense of incomplete. He came to supplement, to fill up. The law was one thing, the prophets another, and with them both, without something else, humanity was poor indeed. He was that something else, that pleroma, that fullness, so that hereafter, for all purposes of living and dying, the world might have all it needed: the law, the prophets, the Jesus, the writings, but perhaps in all three types of scripture in one, in the restoration, right? Without the law, the world is a moral chaos. With the law, And without the prophets, the world is a company of condemned malefactors. With the law and prophets, the condemned world is hoping with hope deferred that makes the heart sick. Really? How? Unless we get all fanatical and it's like, oh, the prophets are dead. It's like, yeah, but are their teachings valid for us? Is our example valid for us? With the law, the prophets, and Jesus, mankind have their hopes fulfilled. And such an element of power from love, and such an element of love newly developed in the law, that life becomes the sublime occupation of preparing the soul by obedience for still greater obedience to a moral rule, which helps keep the universe in rhythm. I am come, said he, not a relaxer, but a completer. Restore. Plerose is not that something's done once and it never has to be done again. It's like, well, the yearly sacrifice doesn't have to be done more than once, but, individuals do their own once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage or whatever they are going to do once in a lifetime, but, it's not that nobody else does it again. That's kind of silly, right? Well, if you're vicarious and all that, but that's what Christianity is about, is putting off the responsibility of one's own beliefs and deeds on someone else. This great Jesus must have been a consciousness of the vast spiritual resources, a fullness of soul that was to stream out into the nations and down through the ages. He felt that he had enough soul for himself and a whole race of men. It is not necessary to go into the minute details of the theological anatomists. They have said nothing finer than Augustine, because he came to give love, and love is the fulfilling of the law. He has rightly said that he had not come to dissolve, but to complete. Well, you don't refurbish something and it's like, well, I better destroy it because I've restored it. It's like, no. But the pleroma, think about that a second, that the pleroma, just like the comforter, it's something different than Jesus in the context. It's just the fullness of living the spiritual life, which is on an individual basis? Or is it some sort of a causal or spiritual reality that is something somebody can experience? You might want to look into Gnosticism, you could say. And the quote from Augustine, quia venit der caritatem et caritas preficit legem merito dixit non venisse salvere sed implere. Augustine, Sermon 126 on John 5. The moral law is to stand while earth and heaven endure, a proverbial form of expression, like, as Strong says, are less elegant one of while grass grows or water runs. While there is any universe of moral beings, there will be moral law. Not a particle is superfluous. Not a particle, therefore, shall ever be swept away. Not a yud, the smallest of Hebrew letters. Not a kapaya, the smallest stroke of the pen, is used to distinguish letters. That this may be understood, let the reader who does not understand Hebrew compare with his eye the Hebrew letters Ra'ish and Dowleth. He will see in print that the only difference is a slight prolongation to the right of the upper part of the letter. In writing them for the printer, I have made a Ra'ish in both instances, and in the latter merely added a little stroke in the right place, a stroke much smaller than the Hebrew letter the same type. And of course, there were dots, sometimes indicating that there used to be a letter there, sometimes not. So you can't just willy nilly add, oh, I want a wow and an aleph and maybe hey or something. It's like that stuff maybe often was not there, right? But a grace that is in neither letters nor laws shall be given the world, and mankind shall see how beautiful and unselfish and free a thing of life obedience may be, of obedience to God's laws, not man's moral police enactments, perhaps, but God's laws. He that regards reverently the slightest indication of what the will and purpose of God is shall be recognized great in the dominion of the universe, the kingdom and rule which is so wide as to embrace not merely this present scheme of our world, but all the changes of all worlds, and all the sweep of the universe, not merely the ages which mark the history of man, but the cycles on which eternity rests. Thus, Jesus taught that he did not come as some feared and others hoped, an adversary to the God-ordained moral government of the world. He came to explain, exemplify, fulfill. His life, his deeds, his words, all were part of the cosmos, the orderly universe. He wished no one to become his follower under the false idea that he can thereby indulge a dissolute life with impunity. Matthew 7:21, right? It's not the only place, but I'm not as adept at quoting biblical stuff as I used to be. He has no higher law than the law of God, but he sets that in the highest possible light. Refutation of Pharisaic Pharisaic errors. For thus I say unto you that if your righteousness do not greatly exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of the heavens. So, deal with your pride and deal with your belief, because it's not just deeds, right? Anyways. Because Jesus had not kept the law according to their methods of interpretation, the Pharisees persecuted him as a dissolver of the law. So, see, that wasn't his intention at all. It's more like fundamentalists. It's like, well, I'm going to follow the law. Not always an interpretation of the law, but I want to follow the law, right? He turns upon them. He denounces as small and low the righteousness in which they so much exalted, and declared to his disciples in words which he introduces with the utmost solemnity that to have the freedom of the dominion of the universe, they must have a wider and higher righteousness, a righteousness founded not on a microscopic view of ritualism, but on a comprehension of the spirit of the laws which spread wide as all worlds and endure long as eternity. The Pharisees taught that their righteousness could, and in many cases did, exceed the requirements of God's moral law. But Jesus taught that the law was so wonderfully deep and broad and high that it is not in the compass of human capacities to exceed its requirement of murder, which is actually different than killing. Well, murder is a type of killing, but Jesus does not leave so important a matter to the impression which a general statement might make upon promiscuous assembly. Well, unrestrained mixing of the sexes. It's not the same thing as co-ed, right? It's a type of co-ed, right? He intends to make his feud with the Pharisaism daily, with Pharisaism deadly. Okay, he will now cut it up in detail. The plain people shall know what he means. He tells them that the law which was given anciently to their ancestors has been read in temple and synagogue by the Pharisees. As soon as the Mishnah and other such texts appeared, people started to study that, and certain other conservative texts have been thus studied in places of worship. Of course, people give sermons, so it's the same thing, but it often, in Judaism, it tends to take the place of Scripture itself as what you understand the rulings. It's like, well, but there were multiple opinions among the rabbis about this verse. It's like, well, like you can't support your opinion with the Scripture. You have to support it with the rabbi. So who's the greater position in the whole thing? But who held the position of official expounders, and who so wove their glosses into the original text that the common people had lost all discrimination, so that the general belief that Pharisaism and Mosaicism was the same. Pharisaism and Mosaicism. He intends to tear away all the wretched sophisms and dangerous as well as foolish various readings of the Pharisees. While there were undoubtedly varieties available of certain verses, right? And show them what the moral law means. He does not impugn the Mosaic law. He simply does two things. Namely, he clears away the rubbish that has been piled on the law, and when it is seen as it is, he explains what its real meaning is, a meaning not to be confined to the ancients, but such as shall be good for any part of the domain of the universe. And some of these explanations of various scriptures take things further away from what's scientifically or otherwise valid, to the point where people flee religion. Ye have heard that it was said to the ancients, Thou shalt not kill, for whoever shall kill shall be liable to the judgment. Well, everything is something that people will have opinions of. But I say unto you, anyone angry with his brother shall be liable to the judgment. And whoso shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be liable to the Sanhedrim. And who shall say Mora shall be liable to the Gehenna of fire. Basically hell, right? But, so we're not talking about the valley, but we do say, well, the comparison of the south of Jerusalem, where there used to be all sorts of, rotting bodies and trash and all sorts of stuff. But, well, if they were going to cremate someone, they did it out there. But, if therefore thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there remembered that thy brother has something against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and first go become reconciled to thy brother, and then coming offer thy gift, agree with thy adversary quickly, whilst thou art with him on the road, lest thine adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge to the sheriff, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt not come thence until thou hast paid the last farthing. So, of course, it's very important to regard the real-world consequences of your deeds. In the common version, the phrase without a cause occurs, but it is generally conceded that this is an interpolation which has crept in from some marginal note written by some very conservative reader or editor. It is not in the Sinaitic Codex, and it is also omitted by other ancient manuscripts. And this sort of opinion would also go along with what the LDS and the Christian Scientist and the Seventh-day Adventist postulated, that if it's not part of the ancient Greek manuscripts, if it's got to be before the Jerome Bible, right? So those first, second, third century, well, 4th century of the Common Era text, yeah, if it's not there, that's already 10,000 something variations, then, it's not going to end up in their Bible. So they selected what to include based on that. So I totally understand that. It's like, well, what, the church gets to add new words and verses at later times, or this other church does this and they play games with this word over here. The King James Version of the Bible actually plays some games to minimize some issues, and who knows, I don't really know the extent of other than that, but the errors into which the ancients fell and were hugely exaggerated in the Pharisees grew out of a literal interpretation which naturally came to be erroneous and injurious. Well, no, see, that was the problem, is the tradition. There were variations, nowhere near to what they did with the Christian side of the Bible, but, a literist. Oh, and a lot of the non-canonical text sometimes basically stayed what they were, rather than, something in the margin, I'm going to take this in and put this out. And, a literalist and advocate or pedagogue takes up a passage in a statute and says, what do these words mean? Of course he soon comes to consider what they may mean. A great jurist, especially if he have judicial responsibility, takes up the same passage and says, what did the legislator mean when it enacted this statute and framed this special passage? The former needs only to have the very words before him. The latter must know the character and general intentions of the legislator, the occasion of the passage of the statute, the objections urged by the minority, and how answered by the majority, the whole animus of the lawmakers as touching this special matter. This is just what Jesus did, and it is important now for a fair understanding of all his own words in this sermon and elsewhere, that we bring to their elucidation and interpretation the same spirit and method of criticism which he applied to the Decalogue. We must know what Jesus said and find the meaning of any doubtful or perplexing phrase or sentence by what he plainly teaches elsewhere, and by the whole temper of his intellect and soul. Whoever fails to do this becomes towards the teachings of Jesus just what the Pharisees became towards the moral law. We shall almost immediately have occasion to show the importance of this principle. And now comes the first example. Moses said, kill not. The Pharisees said, if a man commit actual homicide, he shall be liable to go before the court of the seven. Jesus said, anger with one's brother is a violation of the moral law. In this particular, see, one of the issues that people have is they forget all these little things that lead up. Oh, well, let's figure out what to do with our emotions and our thoughts, and those are huge things, right? But and then there's the things that are listed as little sins, and they're like, at least I don't do the big ones. It's like, we're going to do some of the big ones, don't worry. If you just open little doors here and there, it will be seen how these differ, and a little fullness here may save space hereafter. The Pharisees taught such a morality that if a man who had the most inhuman or most deadly feelings towards his brother had so imagined the circumstances of the homicide, or so suppressed or arranged evidence as to be able to secure a verdict of acquittal from the court of seven, he felt himself altogether absolved. But Jesus showed that the law was not a mere police regulation. It was that, but vastly more. It touched the kingdom of the heavens. It rendered human life sacred, but it was also a development out into the sphere of humanity, of that measurelessly profound law of love which pervades the dominion of the universe, a law which was violated if one had hatred of his brother, or contempt, or scorn. Nay, one must not even so much as fail of loving. It is not sufficient not to hate. Jesus teaches positive regard for our fellow men. He was the great humanitarian on the broadest and deepest foundation of principle, not merely by the impulse of sentiment. Because people call emotional ignorance. It's not a problem with emotion. It's a problem with, whatever emotion rises up, or feelings are different than emotions. It's like, there's an impulse. I better follow my impulse. It's like, stop and think. Thank you very much. And then people are like, you just love or all this other stuff. It's like, there's a difference in what people's emotions and their desires, and they're not all to be dealt with exactly the same, right? Jesus taught in popular style and presented his doctrine so concretely that his words would stick in the memory of his hearers. In illustration, he quotes words in common use as expressions of a malign condition of the heart. Not that they have any damning power in themselves, as Alfred says, but to represent states of anger and hostility. If one should call his brother Raka, okay, tell us what Raka means, thank you very much. He should be regarded by God as one who is regarded by men when the Sanhedrin has condemned them. What are the reasons? Not, let's think of different ways. It's like just, right. If one should call his brother Mora, he shall be, bitter? Is that the word for bitter? Should be in sight of God as the sight of men, as he who, having been stoned to death, cast into the valley of Hinnom. Because we're talking a body that's been left to rot. Because you don't want it fully ripe when you shut up the stone box. Is that the issue? Raka is a childy word expressive of the greatest contempt. Worthless fellow, empty head. Mora is a harsher expression which signifies a hopeless fool, an impious wretch, a rebel, especially rebel against God, and hence an atheist, a word so bitter that for using it, Moses and Aaron were not permitted to enter the promised land. Numbers 20:10. There is a deep ravine to the south and west of Jerusalem, which took its name, as Stanley conjectures, from some ancient hero who had encamped there, the son of Hinnom. He's making up a thing, right? I've talked more about the hells and all that stuff of, in programs dealing with Goetia and Satanism or something. But in this ravine, heathenish rites were observed in the worship of Moloch, and in its southeastern corner, Tophet infants were sacrificed to the fire gods. The fire entities, the jinn. Isaiah talks about this and stuff like this. There's a creature like human, because it has free will, but this creature is a fire. There's other passages that indicate that the angels that fell were not the type of creation as the light beings, the ungendered, whatever, but some mythologies make it easier to understand than others, and when we render it in English, the Bible is a lot more spiritual of a text if you read it in its original, but, in Aramea and even Greek in some places, but King Josiah, there's no J sound, and the S's are usually sh sounds, but I don't know in this case if that's the case, or this, he caused the place to be polluted by strewing it with human bones and other things, making it ceremonially unclean, so as to put an end to these abominations. See 2 Kings 23, 10, 13, 14, and 2 Chronicles 34, 4 and 5. Thereafter it was the common cesspool of the city into which all filth was cast, and it is believed that the bodies of criminals who have been stoned to death were flung into this place. In Joshua 18:16, the Septuagint has Gehenna. Afterwards it was rendered Gehenna. But see, the references, it's like hell, right? But let's remember that that's the Catholic Septuagint. The Septuagint of the Jews wasn't even the book of Joshua. It was only the 5 books of Moses. And that would be a very, very valuable text in more than financial ways if the Jewish Septuagint was ever found, or even portions of it. Because the Catholic Septuagint was the 24 books of Tanakh, wasn't it? Didn't they render the whole thing into Greek? And there were some leading translations to support Christianity in which none of the Aramea text ever would. Wretched is a winnowing fork, a shovel to cast things away with. Mara is a rebel. Mara is, having a view. So I guess each of those things could be used derisively. But without the extra aleph, it's, bitterness and content and great and heavy. And just plain ruka would be, they're calling you soft. And